The year is 479 BCE. Greece stands on the edge of annihilation. 9 years earlier, a storm of fire and steel descended upon this small land of city-states. At Marathon, in 490 BCE, the Athenians stunned the world by repelling the First Persian Invasion. They had shown that even the mightiest empire could bleed. But the Persians do not forget. In 480, Xerxes, the great king, returned with vengeance. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, carved a canal through Mount Athos, and summoned an army so vast it drank rivers dry. Ancient writers claimed millions marched with him, though modern estimates placed the number in the hundreds of thousands. Either way, it was the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen. They poured into Greece like a tide. At Thermopylae, King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans made their immortal stand, buying time with their blood. At Artemisium, Greek triremes clashed with the Persian fleet, and at Salamis, a desperate alliance of Greek city-states tricked and trapped Xerxes' navy, smashing it in the narrow straits. Humiliated, Xerxes returned to Asia. But he left behind an army still vast, still deadly. He left behind his most trusted general, Mardonius. Mardonius's task was simple but immense: finish what Xerxes could not. Crush the Greeks once and for all. This is the story of the final act of the Persian Wars. The battle that decided the fate of Greece, and with it, the future of Western civilization. This is the Battle of Plataea. To understand the scale of Mardonius's task, we have to look back just 1 year. The Persian king of kings, Xerxes, had personally led one of the largest invasion forces the ancient world had ever seen into Greece. He burned Athens to the ground, and city after city had either fallen or submitted. But then came the naval battle of Salamis, where the supposedly invincible Persian armada was broken by a smaller, savvier Greek fleet. This defeat put Xerxes in a difficult position. With his navy crippled, his supply lines were vulnerable. Remaining in Greece with his entire army was a logistical nightmare. So, Xerxes retreated, taking the bulk of his forces with him. But the war was far from over. He left his brother-in-law, Mardonius, in command of a hand-picked force to complete the conquest. This was no mere garrison. Ancient historians like Herodotus claim Mardonius commanded a staggering 300,000 men. This army was composed of the best Persian infantry, its famously devastating cavalry, and loyal Greek allies. In the eyes of Mardonius, it was more than enough to crush the remaining resistance. Mardonius had been a vocal supporter of the invasion from the very beginning. He saw the Greeks as disorganized, constantly squabbling, and militarily inferior. The defeat at Salamis, in his mind, was a fluke, a naval problem that had no bearing on a true contest of arms on land. Before resuming the fight, Mardonius tried to break the Greek alliance not with force, but with a tempting offer. He knew the heart of the Greek resistance was Athens. The Athenians had paid the highest price, abandoning their city to be burned. Without their fleet, the Greek cause was hopeless. So, he sent an envoy to Athens with an incredible proposition. The terms were almost too generous to believe. Mardonius promised not only to rebuild their ruined city at Persian expense, but also to grant them new lands and accept them as a privileged, self-governing ally of the empire. For a people who were now refugees, their city in ashes, the offer must have been tantalizing. The Spartans, terrified Athens would accept, sent their own messengers, pleading with them to refuse. This was Mardonius's first great miscalculation. As a product of a despotic empire, he understood motivations of power, wealth, and self-interest. He simply could not comprehend the burgeoning Greek idea of eleutheria, a concept of liberty they were willing to die for. The Athenian reply became legendary. They told the Spartan envoys to have no fear and then delivered their answer to the Persians. Tell Mardonius that so long as the sun continues on its course, we will never come to terms with Xerxes. It was an absolute rejection based not on strategy, but on an ideological refusal to be subjects. For Mardonius, this was incomprehensible. His attempt at shrewd diplomacy had been thrown back in his face. Spurned, his arrogance turned to rage. If the Athenians would not accept his generosity, they would feel his wrath. He marched his army south and occupied Athens for a second time. He ordered the city, already a ruin, to be burned again, a final vindictive punishment for their defiance. This act served no real military purpose. In fact, it was a strategic mistake, as it only unified the Greeks in their hatred for him, making them even more dangerous. With diplomacy a failure, Mardonius knew a decisive battle was unavoidable. The allied armies of the Greek city-states were gathering, forming what was for them an enormous force. But Mardonius needed to fight on his terms. The rugged hills around Athens were a death trap for his greatest weapon, the cavalry. So he made a calculated withdrawal. Mardonius abandoned the ruins of Athens and marched north into the region of Boeotia. The choice was deliberate. The plains there were wide, flat, and perfect for his horsemen. Near the town of Platea, he found his ideal battlefield and ordered his men to construct a huge, fortified encampment. Herodotus describes it as a wooden palisade 10 stadia square. From this fortress, he could look out upon the plains and wait. Here, his second great blunder took root. The logic of choosing the battlefield was sound. The blunder was in the arrogant assumption that his enemies would be foolish enough to walk into the trap. He expected the Greek army to march down from the hills and deploy on the plain, where his cavalry could harass their flanks and ride them down. But the Greeks were not fools. The allied army, under the command of the Spartan regent Pausanias, was a coalition of rivals, but on one thing they all agreed: charging onto the open plain against the Persian cavalry would be suicide. In total, they likely numbered around 40,000 disciplined heavy infantry known as hoplites. When the Greek army arrived, they did the one thing Mardonius hadn't planned for. They refused to take the bait. Instead of descending onto the plain, they took up a strong defensive position on the high ground along the slopes of Mount Scytharon. From here, the broken terrain neutralized the Persian cavalry. Mardonius' plan for a quick, decisive battle had just evaporated. For 11 tense days, the two armies stared at each other across the valley. An agonizing stalemate set in. Mardonius grew increasingly impatient. His huge army needed constant supplies, and the longer he waited, the more his resources dwindled. He needed to force the issue. He began by sending waves of cavalry, led by his respected commander Mightiest, to harass the Greek lines. They galloped up to the Greek positions, launching javelins and arrows, trying to taunt them into the open. In one of these skirmishes, a volley of Athenian arrows brought down Mightiest's horse. When he fell, he was swarmed by hoplites. His armor protected him until a soldier thrust a spear through his eye slit. The death of Mightiest was a tremendous blow to Persian morale. For the Greeks, it was a huge boost. They had faced the best of the Persian cavalry and killed its commander. This setback only fueled Mardonius's frustration. His advisors, particularly a Theban commander named Artabazus, urged caution. Artabazus suggested they retreat to the friendly city of Thebes and use their vast treasury to bribe the Greek leaders one by one. But Mardonius saw this as cowardly. His pride demanded a glorious military victory. It was then that he committed his third great blunder. He approved a daring cavalry raid, not against the Greek front, but against their rear. The raid was a spectacular success. The Persian horsemen swept around the Greek position, capturing a supply train and, more importantly, locating the Gargaphian Spring, the primary water source for the entire Greek army. They charged in, fouling the spring and cutting off the Greeks' access to fresh water. On the surface, it was a brilliant move. Mardonius believed he had finally forced their hand. He thought the Greeks would now have no choice but to attack him on his terms or retreat in chaos. But in creating a crisis for the Greeks, he had created chaos on the field, leading him to see an opportunity that wasn't really there. Deprived of food and water, the Greek commanders made a risky decision. They would execute a nighttime withdrawal to a new position in front of the town of Platea, where they would have cover and access to water. But the plan, which required different parts of the army to coordinate in the dark, quickly fell apart. The Allied contingents in the center of the Greek line retreated too far, effectively vanishing from the battlefield. On the right flank, A stubborn Spartan officer refused to retreat, arguing it was a cowardly act. By the time the Spartan commander, Pausanias, finally got his men moving, the sun was rising. From his command post, Mardonius awoke to a startling sight. The Greek center was gone. The Athenians on the left appeared to be withdrawing. And most importantly, he could see the feared Spartans seemingly in a full disorganized retreat. This was the moment his arrogance delivered the fatal blow. He saw exactly what his prejudice wanted him to see. Cowardly Greeks, broken by his pressure, fleeing before him. He didn't send scouts. He didn't consider it might be a trap. In a fit of triumphant hubris, he turned to his men, gloating about Spartan cowardice. Then he gave the order for an all-out pursuit. Without forming a proper battle line, Mardonius personally led his elite troops in a mad dash across the river. It was a chaotic swarm, charging forward to hunt down a supposedly fleeing foe. But the foe was not fleeing. Pausanias, seeing the Persian horde surging towards him, knew his men were caught. He sent a desperate message to the Athenians for help. But they were busy fighting Mardonius's Theban allies. The Spartans and their Tegean allies were on their own. Pausanias gave the order, and the Spartan phalanx, that engine of war, halted its retreat, lowered its spears, and turned to face the charge. The clash was a slaughter. The lightly armed Persian infantry, many carrying wicker shields and short spears, crashed into the wall of bronze-clad Spartan hoplites. The disciplined Greeks, with their superior armor, long spears and interlocking shields, had the supreme advantage in close quarters combat. The Persians fought with incredible courage, grabbing at spears with their bare hands. But bravery was no match for equipment and discipline. The Spartan line began to systematically grind through the Persian ranks. Mardonius, true to his nature, was in the thick of the fight, mounted on a white horse, and that is what sealed his fate. In the chaos, Herodotus tells us a Spartan soldier named Amnestus hefted a stone and struck Mardonius in the head, killing him instantly. The death of Mardonius was the breaking point. With the force of his will gone, the Persian army's morale shattered, panic spread, and the charge became a rout. The Persians fled back toward the only place of safety they knew, their fortified camp. The cautious Artabazus, who had held his own large contingent back from Mardonius's foolish charge, saw what was happening. He wheeled his men, a force Herodotus claims numbered 40,000, and began a full retreat, not to the camp, but all the way out of Greece, saving his men from the disaster he had predicted. The rest of the routed Persians crowded into their wooden fortress, but their relief was short-lived. The Greeks pursued them relentlessly. The Spartans were stymied by the walls, but the Athenians, more experienced with assaulting fortifications, soon arrived and breached the palisade. What happened inside the camp was a massacre. Trapped, the Persian forces were cut down by the enraged Greeks. Of the massive army Mardonius had led, the losses were catastrophic. In what ancient writers considered a divinely timed coincidence, they claimed that on the very same day, the Greek fleet landed at Mycale and destroyed the remnants of the Persian navy. The twin victories at Plataea and Mycale brought the Second Persian Invasion of Greece to a bloody and decisive end. The question we asked at the beginning now has its answer. An unstoppable force was defeated because it was led by a man whose arrogance was greater than his army. Mardonius chose the right battlefield, but assumed his enemy would be stupid. He failed to understand his opponents, thinking bribes could conquer a people fighting for an idea. He grew impatient, and in the final, critical moment, he saw a phantom of cowardice and charged his army headfirst into a wall of steel. The Greek victory at Platea did more than just end a war. It preserved Greek independence. The golden age of Athens, the era of the Parthenon, of Socrates and Plato, may never have come to pass. The radical concept of democratia, ruled by the people, might have been erased, a forgotten experiment crushed under the heel of a Persian governor. The victory allowed Greek civilization to flourish, creating foundational pillars of philosophy, art, and governance that would echo through the centuries. Mardonius's blunder didn't just lose him a battle. His failure to conquer Greece ensured that its ideas would one day conquer the world.